Oh man, my dog is dropping fucking bombs, dude. It stinks so much.
That's terrific.
Oh.
All of a sudden you jump back on and you're doing a bunch of catch up, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. The one thing I didn't anticipate was that I could still get Messenger stuff, and so people are just still, getting in there. I got a phone call from a guy. I have no idea how he got my phone number, and it was a firefighter. He said he went off because of PTSD, but I swear to God, this guy was fucking manic, man. Like. And like, so probably like 4 or 5 times I just was like, well, I mean, he's like wanting to get together. And I'm like, I'm really sorry. I'm not doing any of that right now. And then he would just go off on some other, like, nice guy. He wasn't like mean or mad or anything like that. But oh my God. I was like, how the fuck did you get my cell phone number? Yeah. So.
Oh, you don't have it posted all over the internet?
Well, he scared me when he's like, yeah, I got it from some naturopath. I'm like, where the fuck is my name in a naturopath office? And why is it in a naturopath office?
Yeah. Oh, that's where you were repping for the essential oils.
That's right. Yeah, that's where I'm cure-alls.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. Like, I hate to be like a fucking useless slug here. I'm not sure what we should chat about it, but what would be worth getting into.
Well, I don't know. Let's maybe discuss reasons why this meme went viral. I think mainly it just has to do with the fact that it's so relatable to just about everybody.
Sure. Yeah. Can you sent it to me? Where is it? It was the list of the burnout
reasons why you're exhausted.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you just a sec.
You sent it to me before. I'm just trying to think of where it was. There it is. Yeah, I think that it's are you sending me stuff? I'm getting dinging in my ear.
No, you just got a tumor.
Fuck, not another one.
I don't know. I could say I've definitely been unmotivated and irritated, but everything else, well, maybe trouble sleeping.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely felt most of these. I think a good way to look at some of this stuff, when they talk about how they're breaking these pieces down, I always explain to folks this idea of like cognitive currency. I can't remember. Have we talked about this before?
I think you've mentioned it a couple times.
Right. Well, I don't want to be boring.
It's like a give and take, right?
Yeah, sort of. Like if you think about it, there's lots of analogies. Usually people talk about like pitcher and water. But you can talk about whatever, but essentially it's like you've only got so much cognitive money to give out to, everything. And so you think about every decision you make and every interaction you have is a small loan out to of the bank. And so when I'm looking at these things, what happens is when that thing gets low, you run out of this money, and so people are continuously asking you for money or for loans, and you're running out and you can't give them any of that, right? So
just like how you're feeling right now.
Yeah.
I've got to tap out for a bit. I totally get it, because I run into those. I obviously I've not, like, I read it through quite a few times before I decided to post it, and each one stuck out to me in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
And that was exactly it. Like it goes back to becoming emotionally drained.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just I like to call it overwhelmed, and I mean, I tend to put my headphones on and I just zone out for a little while, and the kids totally understand that. They're very, very understanding when it's time to take a break. It's time to take a break, you know. And my wife does it too when she comes home from work. She just sometimes it's just a long day and she's got to take a break. You've given everything that you can. I think some of the ways to kind of combat that is to be able to go into your own world and, I guess, recharge. Everybody needs to be able to recharge in their own way.
Totally. No, I think that makes a whole lot of sense. And I mean, when you talk about being overwhelmed too, part of like, so if you were to come in and sit in my chair and you say, I'm feeling overwhelmed today, one of the things that I do is push you on that. Because we all know, like, we all get a sense of what we mean when we say overwhelmed, but really when we're talking about being overwhelmed, we're talking about experiencing multiple emotions to a high degree, and I can't tell them apart, right? And what happens is especially if we're struggling with like anxiety or depression or anything really, but what tends to happen then is our brains take over. So if I say I'm overwhelmed, then I might be feeling also kind of confused about what I'm feeling, and then that can be scary because I don't actually know, right? And so what we do is we tend to push away things that we don't understand, or that are uncomfortable or unpleasant, right? We just want them to go away, which can be really effective short-term strategy. What happens if we continuously use that in the long term is that we go on to struggle. And I don't mean like develop anything, but I mean you can look at this list of things and you could go on to start to experience these, right? Because we're constantly pushing things away. So if stress, for instance, is something that's really getting to me, and every time I turn around there's something else stressing me out, you know what I mean? Like I'm going to grow irritated because I'm growing tired of having to push this away, or I'm actually getting frustrated that I'm constantly reminded of it.
I see, and now that I look back, there's been lots of times that's exactly how it is, because you kind of get confused with your emotions. I've definitely felt that just the other day when we were dealing with our house. I think that's exactly what it is, because I was kind of feeling I was already exhausted at that point because I had worked 3 shifts in a row. And then I was coming home and dealing with the family and the kids and trying to get everything organized for the sale of the house. And so I had almost a nervousness, excitement on top of the stress that's compiling, on top of being a little bit worried because who knows if the house is going to sell and yada, yada, yada. So I totally get that. Your multiple emotions, and then your brain is just like, holy shit, what am I supposed to do?
That's right. Yeah, it's not really good at processing multiple things, right? Like, a cool analogy is actually like the reason why, if one of your kids bumps their knee and you rub it, why that actually feels better is because your brain can't process a lot of the stimuli at the same time. So it's either we flood it with the pain stuff or we flood it with that kind of calming. And so that's one of the reasons that works. And similarly with emotions, I mean, you start to feel one or two emotions. I mean, often it's one. Like if somebody comes in and says they're overwhelmed, we can drill in, and it's usually just one emotion that they're feeling very strongly, right? But if you start to add more than that, it can really become confusing, right? Like, what's the difference between excited and nervous? Right?
I think they're both the same thing. They're just portrayed in different ways. And that's where you got to kind of realize the difference, right? Like you might be nervous to go out on stage, but really you're excited to go out on stage.
Or are you both? Right?
Right.
Like physiologically, they're the same thing, right? So, another cool example to think about, right, is especially around anxiety. If somebody comes in and they're talking about that, I said, like, if you explain to me what you feel when you're anxious, is exactly what you might say somebody who's on a roller coaster feels like. Except for on the roller coaster, we're having a great time, presumably, as long as you don't like roller coasters. And in the waiting room, you're not having such a great time. It's perspective, right? It's so it's perspective, and it's also just like the atmosphere and environment that we're in as well. Because if I take the exact same feelings that you feel when you're on a roller coaster, but I give them to you right now as you're sitting there, those experiences are going to be taken two completely different ways. And one might, be something that kind of spirals out of control, and then you go into like a panic attack, where the other is you're having a great time on a roller coaster and it's going to be over in a few minutes.
Oh yeah, I totally get that. And it's funny how closely like those two things, like you were saying, physiologically, they're the same, and how easily you can relate the two. But
Mhm.
do you think making it, splitting the two in your mind, do you think that would help with either of them?
I think it's important to do that, actually, right? So, um, I think that what's helpful, especially when we're dealing with certain disorders, or struggles, even if we're struggling in life, looking at um, w- knowing which one we're feeling, like a really standard CBT approach would be saying, okay, you're feeling multiple things. Let's rank them. Which one's the highest, and let's navigate and deal with that one first, right? So that's we're constantly asking you to split and separate out what you're feeling, because if we go out on a date, we can be super nervous. We can be excited as well, right? And
Well,
so now we're
you and I
feeling
will just hold
both.
hands, and that'll help.
Well, yeah. I mean, it just and I'm already just like over the moon, right? So it's not even nervousness or anything like that. It's just straight love. But um, if we're thinking about that, we go out on that. That's a real visceral, nervous, but also excited. And so I'm both of these things, right? But it's also the perspective of it, right? If I'm thinking this is gonna fucking tank and it's gonna be terrible and they're gonna make me pay for the bill and or whatever, I'm gonna have I might create having a shitty time in my mind, and then therefore I start to have a shitty time. I start to find all of the evidence in that date and interactions that are me having a shitty time.
What you seek, you shall find.
A lot of the time, man, a lot of the time, right? And what happens is our brains are pre-programmed to find those bad things, right? Evolutionarily. And so then, you're fighting evolution. Sometimes you're fighting evidence that shitty things happen because shitty things fucking happen. I mean, we know that firsthand. That's what the job is on, is dealing with shitty things happening, right? And then you look at, some people have the misfortune of multiple shitty things happening. And so we develop this core belief around the world being a really dangerous place. And of course, that's true, but I can use that knowledge to bury me, or I can use that knowledge to kind of,
Rise above it.
yeah, in a lot of ways.
See, and that's where I wanted to start that other YouTube channel, just basically on mindset, on that
Hmm.
exact thing, right? Because you're right. What you seek, you find, and if you're constantly negative about things, you're constantly going to get negative results, and
Yeah.
that's going to drive you down. So, like when you come into a situation where you might be nervous or excited, how would you handle it in that sense then to kind of keep your mind more on track, so that way you don't go into those spirals?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it just depends on the situation too, because certainly there's a certain level of distress that you want to be in, or stress, I should say, not distress, that you want to be in. That's actually a motivating factor, right? Which might make a date go well, right? The butterflies, you use them to your advantage. But that mindset could be the thing that pushes you over into distress, and then therefore, the more distressed we are, motivation and activation starts to go down until we hit, the rock bottom would be the freeze experience that we know about.
Yeah, I get that.
Hmm.
Is it so like a grounding technique essentially when you go in, that I like to call that little bit of stress that you are having, growth stress. Like when you go to the gym, you're doing a positive stress that's going to help you advance further into what it is you're working towards.
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure, physiologically is a bit out of my wheelhouse. I'm not sure what the parallels would be, but essentially mentally, that's the same. I mean, we call it eustress, which is essentially just good stress. This is you're about to present and you're nervous, but you can switch that to, being animated and doing a really good presentation, or what I imagine you do, like going out on a stage in front of millions of people, right? I'm guessing that that's a good, stress that you want everything to go out, everything needs to work and go fine and all of that. But so I think the parallels would be the same. Now, you go to the gym, you're certainly putting things under stress, but I don't see how that's much different um, than what happens if we're able to keep stress to a certain level. I mean, ideally, if you look at a bell curve, right before the apex, right? That's kind of where you want to be. That's the zone you want to be in. Just enough stretch to motivate you constantly to get things done, right? But most of us, I think, can agree that we appreciate kind of being at the floor and not really near the ceiling when it comes to experiencing those things, regardless of whether it's distress or eustress.
I agree. Nobody
Yeah,
wants to be way up there.
yeah. Have you seen this video by Kelly McGonigal? Have you ever heard of her?
Nope.
Let me pull this up, and it's called. I love it because it's very contradictory to what we're being told. It's called "Make Stress Your Friend." It's a TED Talk. I'll send you. Can I send you stuff here? Yeah, look at this. Send you that. And so, I mean, we can post it up for people that happen to be watching this too. And she does a phenomenal job at showing, I think, a lot of what you're talking about too, about perception of stress and how that impacts on people. And I can't remember the exact numbers, of course, but if you were to watch it, I think it's within the first kind of 5 minutes or so, she talks about a study that they did where, in the end, the people who saw stress as who viewed stress as more stressful than people who were actually experiencing a lot of stress had more health problems than the people experiencing a lot of stress. So she was identifying that it was actually your perception of stress that was a huge health factor, which is kind of mind blowing when you think
it's the
about
way
it.
that you are handling the stress mentally.
It's
So-
not even how you're handling it. These people, it's how you
How you're
like
seeing
how you perceive stress. Like
Huh.
how you perceive your ability to handle a stressful event was actually more of a predictor of negative health outcomes than how you actually dealt with the stress.
See, and I believe you're, like you were saying earlier, I believe the mindset you have is a big factor on that kind of stuff, and how you handle the stress and how you see the stress. And like, that's one thing my wife always says, I don't know how you're never stressed. And I'm like, well, to me, that's not a stress. You know, like, yeah, it's stressful. And a lot of people looking from the outside are like, holy crap, how are you doing that? But I've been taught how to put out fires, right? Like, and not just physically, but in my life. My dad's trained me all my life how to deal with things in a way that's going to help me better for tomorrow, you know. And you, sometimes, you know, I still fall into the habit where I'm like, I'll just tuck that under the rug and I'll deal with it later. But most times it's like, I'm just thinking about it and I'm like, okay, you got to play it over in your head and you got to do this correctly, because you don't want to screw anything up and you don't want to dig yourself a deeper hole and you don't want to run into any walls. And it's kind of funny that that's the way that he puts it, is like, you know, you got to face it head on and you got to deal with it, and you need to be happy during the entire thing.
That's right.
You know, it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger when he's in the gym, he talks about how he's always smiling after he's done that 6,000 rep and everybody else is tired and grumpy and angry. He goes, well, I know that stress I'm putting myself through in the moment, dealing with it right now, is going to make me get that much closer to the goal. And, you know, and we set goals daily, even if it is just getting out of bed. People don't realize it and they take that for granted. So
I mean, I think there's a lot about that kind of the mindset of just making small accomplishments. I know, like, you know, getting up and making your bed is one that you often hear about, and people scoff at it. But I mean, the premise is that if you know, if you're experiencing depression or low mood, then the mental filters you tend to run by default are these ones that are constantly reinforcing this idea that you know, that things aren't worth it, you're not worth it, things are constantly going bad, the universe is against you. And the idea is that, but if I can accomplish small things, if I can get out of bed and make my bed, even if I just go right back into it, but if I can get out and make my bed, that's a small accomplishment, right? That's, my brain sees that and processes that as something that I've done. I've set out to do a thing and then I did that thing. And motivation, I think, you know, when we talk about like behavioral activation, which is getting you to do a thing you don't want to do, when we talk about motivation, often people think like, you know, I need to be motivated to go to the gym. And I would say, but the point isn't to be motivated to go. You would never go. Like nobody's
That's right.
motivated.
That's right.
Nobody's motivated to join. Really, what's essentially a futuristic torture chamber that you put yourself through every time you go. Right? Nobody's motivated to do that. But what happens is if you go a few times, you start to build that habit, and then that habit turns into a motivation, and then you find that you actually start to feel off when you don't go versus feeling that actual pressure and pain of going to begin with. And so we're looking at motivation at the beginning when really motivation comes at the end. And that's what, I think a lot of times we miss when we're thinking about making change and developing change.
See, and it's funny that you said all that, because in preparation of starting that other channel, like I've already got it going and everything, and I'm trying to do a video series of uploads, like we were talking about doing this one, and having everything, stocked up.
Right.
I just shot a video on how motivation works, and in my thoughts is motivation doesn't exist. You create motivation. You create that drive through daily habits that you're initiating in your life. And that making your bed and accomplishing that one thing, it compiles and starts to compound, hence the motivation, right? You've now, just by getting up and accomplishing that task, have given yourself a little bit of that reward chemical, and boom, now you're motivated to do the next task because you felt good about it. And there's your motivation. And you've just created that motivation. And then those habits start to compound, and then it becomes a natural thing that eventually you'll take for granted because you do it every day anyways, right? Like going to the gym, and you feel better. And the day that you don't go, next thing you know, you're back in that slump and you wish you would have gone. And that's exactly it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I largely agree with all of that stuff. When when we break it down, I think for the layperson who's not dealing with anything, that's a good way of putting, trying to develop a new habit or a new goal, or getting to do a new thing, is this understanding that motivation works that way. But I'm thinking too of folks who are struggling. Really what we're trying to do is instill that confidence that you're able to accomplish things back into your life. And because the majority of people, even when they're struggling, are accomplishing and they're doing things all of the time. It's these mental filters that are running constantly that actually prevent them from being able to see that. And it can take a lot of actually work, and it's exhausting. Plenty of people want to quit when we get to this point in therapy, for instance, because it's so fucking hard to go against that automatic response that we've built in. And just as you said earlier, and I'm the same, and we're all the same. It's like, when I'm faced with the proverbial shock of life, right? So think about the rat in the cage. I'm about to get a shock, and I don't know what it comes from. I'd rather that not happen. And so if I know that if I stick in my little corner in the back, I can avoid them constantly, right? Eventually, I go to the point where I get frozen there, regardless of whether I'm getting a shock or not. And that's that learned helplessness. This idea that there's nothing that I can do, right? And so how they did this, they ran a bunch of tests. They essentially put a little, put a little shock on the bottom of a cage, right? And so normally what happens if we're trying to train, we're training a rat, we're going to shock in one part and we'll go to another part. We'll reward if they go in that part and they can avoid. But if I shock constantly at, at random intervals to the point where the rat realizes that it can't escape it no matter what, it actually just freezes and doesn't move.
Just take it. It reaches a point where it just kind of gives up.
And think about times when you felt so defeated that method, that mode of thinking, or that maybe even that program ran for a bit, right? Where you're just like, fuck it, like, fuck this, like, put your hands up, get in the car, walk away, drive away, throw, do whatever. There's no winning. Right. And we're feeling a little bit of that learned helplessness. And the thing about the human mind is that it's really good at starting to create evidence that shows, right? Maybe, incorrectly, that the whole fucking world is against you about every turn that's coming at you. And therefore, why would I even think that this is going to get better? And this is the trap, right? That's the trap of that learned helplessness, that frozenness. And then you think that over and over again for a long enough period of time. And when, and then we look at suicidality and we're like, well, that's kind of an inevitability. It's actually really surprising to me when people are suffering for so long and they're registering never even had thought of it before, right? Because I'm like, wow, it sounds like you're in an actual real mental hell, and it's surprising to me that you have that resiliency, because I think that's from where I'm sitting anyways, those types of thoughts are really a normal wish of trying to want to get away.
What would you say then some of the coping techniques then to try and get away from those thoughts? What do you think is something somebody can do to climb away from that? Like, is it a slow stepping process that you're going to kind of take it piece by piece, and like you're saying, you chew away at the biggest issue and kind of knock that out of the way first?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think the first thing, kind of to draw this back to what we were talking about earlier, I think the first thing is being able to identify what you're feeling, right? And so not to drown us in metaphors, but another good one I think is, it's spring here. The snow is almost all gone, right? You get out into the garden for the first time, and what happens to your hands? You get blisters, right? And so I get, I've damaged my body, but if I continue to do that thing over and over again, I get calluses, right? And then I can work with, my hands and do heavier and heavier things. Emotionally, we have the same kind of, I think we have the same kind of mechanism at play, right? So if I get hurt over and over and over again, but either by my own thinking, in rationalization and appraisals of situations that, the world's out to get me and it's going to hurt me, or by really being hurt by these things, right? We're talking about real traumas and all of those things. I build an emotional callus. And so it actually makes it really hard for me to retrieve how I'm feeling about things. I may constantly say I feel overwhelmed, or I might feel numb, or I might feel meh, or I might feel whatever, but that's not actually retrievable to me. And then so our work is actually peeling back those calluses, because you still have that underneath, right?
Yeah.
No, so that's the first step. And then the second step is once we can identify those things, or start to, then, we can attack the thoughts as well and say, okay, well, what are things that you're doing that you think, what are some of the ways that you're thinking about situations that actually create, this stuck feeling, that actually make you argue in your mind in a circle.
Oh, so you're breaking down that negative thought that you were talking about earlier, that they're the way that they're constantly thinking, that's sucking them into that world.
Yeah, we call them cognitive distortions. So I'm just Googling, and we'll send you a little list of them. Actually, this is a list I use at work. I'll send this one to you, and you can post it. You can get them anywhere online. There are kind of staple ones that we can all think. Actually, if you take a look, it'd be interesting to see if you can identify any of the ones you use in here. Well, let me do that. Can I just send something to you like this?
Are you sending it through the chat?
I'm trying to. I don't know if it'll let me.
You could do the
I'll just do
Messenger.
You don't have to yell at me. I mean, I can just
do as I say.
Yeah. Incoming.
All right, let's check this out.
Yeah. So, did it send all of it, or is it cut off there?
It's cut off at the bottom.
Oh, good. Okay, well, you can read the first couple here. Let me fix this for you. We can post these for those following at home at a real fucking bored right now. Okay, here we go. All right. So this is the exact list I actually use at work.
There we go.
There it is. So
much clearer too.
Yeah. So we have 10 of them, right? And there's more than this, but this is a really good list of first 10. So, yeah. So we have all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, the mental filter, which I talk a lot about, disqualifying the positive, jumping to conclusion, which actually includes 2 subcategories, magnification or catastrophizing, another one that we often hear about, but also minimalization. Emotional reasoning, which is really important. The should or must statements, labeling, and personalization. Any of those seem familiar to you?
Well, the black and white definitely,
Sure.
especially when you get out on a call, you
Yeah.
definitely push everything into that realm. Like kind of a coping mechanism, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah.
A big one for me, because I'm an entrepreneur and I work on the self-development, is this is my fault, but I
Mm.
take it more in the sense of not almost blaming myself, but taking ownership over it, so I
Mm-hmm.
can improve it, not to kind of beat myself down on it.
Mm-hmm.
What else we got here? Labeling, assigning labels to ourselves or to other people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a loser, I'm completely useless. See, and I don't think I've ever done that one. I've done it in a joking manner.
Sure.
I've probably done it in some sort.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional reasoning, yeah, definitely have done that.
And so this is where it's really important too to start to pull these pieces apart, right? Because if I don't know how I feel, a lot of these are going to be a lot of these are going to be foreign to me, right? Like personalization. I think the important piece about personalization is labeling something as my fault when it actually isn't. So a really classic one of this is people who are so adverse to conflict as to apologize when they're 100% right, because and
So in a sense, they're apologizing just to kind of avoid that.
it's 100% right. They're apologizing to end the fight, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and so they would be doing the personalization all the time. But what do you think that the cognitive impact of constantly saying sorry is?
You're subconsciously telling yourself that you're always wrong.
Constantly, right? Constantly. Um, Emotional reasoning is a really important one because we feel like, and this, this one's sometimes tricky to navigate with people because it can sound invalidating when I'm saying, just because you feel a way doesn't mean that's true, right? And I think, there's a huge push, even maybe socially. Um, Certainly, I get this flavor from a lot of the things I read online is that, you feel a way and that's true and you should be able to feel that and all of those things, right? And it's like, I think this was one of those coming from a good place, but actually kind of fucking wrong in a lot of ways. And so, a good example is, you're walking with a friend down a forest path, you look up and you think you see a bear and you start to freak out. The person walking beside you is laughing. And it's like, what do we do in that situation? It's like, well, if they're laughing, then obviously what I saw was wrong, and therefore I'm an idiot for freaking out, right? Like,
No, you take that time while they're distracted and run.
right, you trip them and
Yeah.
take off, right? Yeah. But you can see how that could play. It's like, oh, like, and then we, job related feedback could be one of these where I'm struggling, but everyone around me seems to not be, and therefore I'm weaker or lesser than, or something's wrong with me
And I
for
think
feeling
that
this way.
aids to the whole stigma end of it as well.
Sure. Right. And then that's how these things start. And so then it's like, well, if I'm wrong on this one, then am I wrong on the next one? And then, I'm pushing these things even further away because it seems like even more things that I can't talk about. And we can see really kind of in live time how this one thinking style, just one, and we use multiple of them, but even if we're just using this one, can actually start to create this closed loop, kind of closed loop cognitive distortions, which end with us feeling stuck, feeling low, feeling less than, and all of those things.
Do you think somebody that's going through that will experience all of these?
I think we all experience all of these, and maybe not all of these, but a lot of them. We've all used some of these at certain times. The problem isn't actually using them, right? So,
Using them properly.
well, it's using them constantly.
Right.
Right. So you talk about being on the job, all or nothing thinking. I think that's right. I think, when we go in, we have SOGs and SOPs for a reason, and we're going to run protocol as we do every time we run. You have seats, some places have, kind of that seat. What am I trying to say? Seat selection. So depending where you're sitting in the truck determines your job. We go out and do a thing. But the idea is when I go home and I start to use that. And then I start to tweak it. Whereas if it didn't turn out exactly as I need it to turn out, then it's a failure, regardless if it was successful or not.
Do you think, especially like when this channel being related to the emergency services and first responders and stuff like that, do you think automatically us as first responders take that home because that's what we're taught?
Well, I think that that's, especially with first responders who are working usually a minimum of 12 hours, we take this home because this is what we practice the most.
Right. It's familiar.
And it's rewarded
Yeah.
constantly, right? Like it's constantly saving us,
Yeah.
right? Using a mental filter or catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is a fantastic one for us to use, right? Like if I get in the truck and I'm running down with minimal information from dispatch, it actually serves me a great purpose.
You always assume the worst, and you prepare for the worst.
You prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Yeah.
What happens though if I start to do that constantly with everything in my life, right? Then I'm constantly creating this roller coaster of emotions, right? Stress and anxiety and all of that for no reason, right? So I have no reason to feel this way. And then therefore that can catch up because that kind of ropes us back into what we're talking about, that cognitive currency. If I have something constantly tapping it, constantly draining the pitcher of water that I have each day, because I'm always constantly thinking about the worst case and how I would get out of that, and then that never happens. You know what I mean? One of the most important questions is that I think, and it's a bit tongue in cheek, but it's like, how often have you're worried about something constantly, and it benefited you at the end,
Never.
even if that thing came true, right? It's like how many times have and you can ask people, and people can write and say if they feel this way. But my question always is when have you ever at the end of an event went, oh, thank God I worried about that because that was like super helpful.
Yeah, see, I think it just adds the stress right up until, like, if it is something that comes true, it just adds the stress up until then, and you're still going to deal with it the same way you were going to deal with it in the beginning.
Right, or you may not deal with it the same way. You may not deal with it the same way because you're so exhausted.
Right.
You may have less of your actual resilience, your ability to deal with it at the time.
No, I have done that. I can say that I have for sure. I think it was petty things, but like I've definitely experienced that because you get to the problem and all of a sudden it's like, deal with it tomorrow.
Sure.
Like, I can't do this right now. I just need to sleep. I need to sleep. Like, I can't deal with this until I've had something to eat. Like.
And I think a lot of the times too, and this is one that's not on the sheet that I often talk about, is this idea that even if I'm faced with the problem, I have to do two things, right? So the first thing that I have to do, if I'm in these mindsets, the first thing I have to do is I have to catastrophize or maximize the danger or the difficulty of that problem. So this is going to be something that's going to be so hard and so painful or whatever. But the second thing I have to do is I'm going to have to minimize my ability to cope with it. So I have to make the problem as big as I can make it and make my belief in my ability to navigate that problem as weak as I can. That's the combination, right? Because if I think that I can navigate any problem, regardless of its difficulty, the difficulty can go up and it's not really a big deal. It just becomes more difficult. But I have to actually create in my mind the problem's the worst it's going to be, and my ability to cope is going to be the least it can be. It's the combination of those two that keeps us stuck.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a different way of looking at it.
And I think there's a lot of these, combinations of thoughts that run parallel, and I think one we've talked about on here before is the hindsight bias, right? We've all heard hindsight's 2020. But the second half of that, which not a lot of us have heard about or talk about, is that when we go back, we think that that decision that we decided that we should have made actually would have made things better. And so we're constantly just thinking about what we didn't do, but we're not entertaining the idea that what we wanted to do might have made things worse. Right? That seems to
Right.
be blocked from our mind.
So like what the decision that we should have made, we don't think that had a negative or a negative position on that. We just play like it would have helped.
That's right. And yeah, and so when you have a crystal ball and you can tell me that for sure you're allowed to think that thought, right? But the idea is that you have no proof that you clocking that person when they said that thing like you wanted to do, right? When you play over and over and again in your head, wouldn't have actually just, unleashed a cascading of things that would have made your life worse, right? It's like I just think that urge of, and that plays on those small insecurities, I think, about, us and what we wish we could do and what we should have done and all of those. Those are the shoulds and the musts. We're looking at those things and thinking, well, if I had just done this, it would have been better. It's like, well, if you had just done this, how do we know that argument wouldn't have exploded? How do we know that your relationship wouldn't have ended right there? How do we know that, 2 days later that wouldn't have blown up in your face? We don't. The idea was you made a decision based on the best information you had at the time.
That's right.
Yeah.
See, and I've definitely had that played over in my head over and over again. And I don't know if it's just me, but I've definitely questioned, like, well, if I would have changed my decision, would it have made a difference? Would it have been positive? Would it have been a negative one? Like, and it that definitely exhausted me. And I think it was in my younger years. And mind you, I'm still pretty young, but you go through a breakup or something like that, and you're like, shit, what could I have done? And then you just ponder on it for the next 2 months.
Yeah, totally. Right.
It just fucks you up.
Yeah, it does. And we can recognize too that those processes do a lot to actually keep us attached to the emotions and feelings that we had. Like a relationship's a perfect one where it keeps us actually attached to that relationship in a lot of the ways.
Yeah.
Right. Like if I'm constantly thinking about how much I hate somebody, I'm just constantly grinding that out. I'm actually still connected to that person. They still have me tethered, and therefore I'm still in that relationship in some sort of way.
So it being a negative thing then, and that's where I've learned a lot from just watching people on YouTube and things like that. They talk about things in the relationship sense, and you take the negative people in your life and you remove them because there's no reason for that stress. Is that one of those things that you can kind of do to deal with some of those issues that you got, and things that are both relating to relationships and not? Is it something like you kind of work towards working them out of your life so you can help better that situation, or do you want people to hang on to those relationships?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, right? Like, so, because I think like there's multiple minds here. I think if you're in a toxic relationship that's clearly like emotionally, physically, whatever abusive, then to leave that relationship is the ultimate goal. But if you're thinking that I need to get rid of, 10 people in my life that actually also happen to be the closest people to me, I think that there's adjacent problems that could arise from that. So you may get the mental freedom of never having all of that come down on you, but then you have the added isolation, which can be even more harmful, right?
True.
Have you heard of Johan Hari?
No.
He was on Rogan, actually, and he did a pretty good. He's been on Rogan twice. He did a TED Talk. I'm not like just hitting on TED Talks all the time.
Oh, I love TED Talks.
Coincidentally, Johan Hari talks about addiction, and so and he talks about the way we look at addiction is wrong, which is a really neat one too. But he's got a new book out called Lost Connections, where he emphasizes the need for community and connection. And so, I think specifically he's looking at as a cure for depression, or a treatment, I should say, for depression.
Lost Connections, you called it?
Yeah, that's what Lost Connections, and Chasing the Scream is his other one. And I'll send you his link here, and
I'll put that in the description. I'll find it on Amazon for your audience.
And then the Rogan one's really good to listen to. But I mean, it's the same as like Sebastian Younger talking about tribe, and that need to be to connected and we're talking often about different communities and stuff like that. So I think that's why it's a tricky question to answer, because the obvious answer would be, really, most people would say, of course, get them out of your life. But if they're the only people in your life, I don't think I don't think the wisest thing to do if somebody's drowning in the ocean is to take the pool floaty away from them first. I think it's to give them a life jacket first, and then you can take the pool floaty away, right? So
Teach them how to deal with the situation and
sure,
separate themselves at a healthy distance without completely removing that person.
yeah, or teach them how to make a healthy relationship, right? How to connect and find healthy relationships, and so they can start to build that network first, and then they're not isolated, right? Sometimes you can't help that. Sometimes you have to isolate, but isolation is a dangerous thing for a very long, like if it's goes on for a while. So that's why I think that's a tough question to really kind of clearly answer.
See, and that's where, like, and I was just trying to get your opinion on it, because I believe, it's very situational, just like that. It's not cut and dry. You need to look at what's happening and who's there and who's
Sure.
involved. And
Yeah.
my big thing is, maybe it's you that is having the problems and
Mm.
making that relationship toxic, or that situation rough for yourself, right?
Hmm.
Maybe it's the way that you're thinking about it. Maybe that's the way that you're handling that person. Maybe you're not fully understanding that person. So that's something to kind of keep in mind too, as I go about trying to make new relationships, and I'm trying to learn about people, so that way I can be,
Hmm.
somewhat catering, but still kind of holding to my own agenda and not fucking myself up.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, you make that's a good point, right? And I think it really trying to find out whether or not is it because of the things that we're talking about today? Is it because of these thinking traps? Is it because of the way I've appraised situations? Is it because my inability to navigate conflict that I begin to I begin to appraise or decide or quantify the relationships that I am in as less than or harmful or whatever, really because I'm uncomfortable.
Right.
And so I think it's situational. I mean, it's tough to talk in generalities because either way would, I think I've seen and heard success either way, right? Cut everybody out and get a new group after, but also about how to find people that are healthy to be around first, and then lean on them a bit as you cut ties with people that could really have been in your life a very long time.
Yeah. So you're almost working on a replacement, like finding another job before you quit.
Sure, right? But I think it gets even more complicated when these people that are in our lives are our family.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, and that's the toughest part, right? When there's a deeper connection, and
Mhm.
I only brought all that up because that's one of the things that could easily cause someone, that mental fatigue, and that just dragging you down. Is a lot of the relationships we're catering to are giving away that currency that we have.
Yeah.
You're constantly feeding those things, and that could go with anything. It can go with literally having to paint the house, or trying to fix
Yeah.
the car, or like, and and that's where I'm trying to learn how to prioritize
Mhm.
and utilize my time appropriate, optimize my mind and my daily time, because that is minimal as well, right? You only get 24 hours in a day. So, you only have so much of everything that you can give, and you need to give it to the most appropriate thing. So
Mhm.
I have been finding the way that you had mentioned earlier, you're kind of gauging how stressful each situation is that you need to deal with, and
Mhm.
then knocking off the very first one. And I've come to the terms that what works for me is knocking off that first one in the day and making my goals for the day, and then going down a few steps to something a little bit easier and ticking off 3 or 4, just so I
Mhm.
can deal with the hardest thing, and it gets it out of the way, and it's done and done, and I'm not dealing with it for days on end stressing about it. And then I can move down a little bit and feel like I've done something with the day by knocking off 5 or 6 more, and then
Mhm.
moving back up the chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I talk to people about this, I talk about leaning in instead of leaning out. And so, your setup for navigating this is you leaning in. So I'm going to lean into the most difficult thing, expose myself to doing that thing, and I'll accomplish it. And then, it's almost a reward that then I'm going to do some of this lesser, maybe even fun things that I want to do. I'll knock those off, and that's the reward. But if we're stuck in these closed loops, which people can get into, I start to attach that fear from, from event or objects or whatever. I start to attach it to everything, and so then, to the point where, and we know that this to be true. It's to the point where sometimes people think that leaving their house is the most dangerous thing that they can do, and so they never do that.
That's true.
Right. And so it's like accomplishing the most stressful thing would be just stepping foot out front of their door. And that's like debilitating. You can't even think about that. Right. So then we're back to creating. We need to create and find ways to reshape that thinking so that you can actually even just think and imagine yourself outside and being successful. That's actually the first step. And then we can work towards actually doing it.
That's a good way to put it. And what essentially what you're doing is you're kind of taking what I was saying and then shrinking it so it works for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And making it a little bit more manageable, bite-sized, and
Yeah.
it's a good way to think about it, especially when you're talking about that mental fatigue. It's the same thing, right? You do that one big thing and it's like, holy crap, I'm drained, and that person climbs back in their hole, and where it's comfortable and it's dark and it's quiet and they're depressed again, and it's easy, and and then you have to somehow figure out how to get them to start over again, and go back to the top the next day and do another task and another task. And I could see how that loop, that repetitive loop, can definitely suck people in.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about breaking things down, so when I'm dealing with somebody who's like severely, severely depressed, let's say, to the point where, maybe my appointment and the mandatory appointments that they have to go to are the only things they're getting out of bed for. My goal with them, my first thing is, so behavioral activation is really important with, especially with depression. My first thing is, listen, each day I want you to stand beside your bed for 5 minutes. If you want to go back to bed after that, if you want to crawl back in, we consider it standing beside your bed for 5 minutes a success. You can go back
An
to
accomplishment. Yeah.
Nice, right. And then so then they do that, I have them keep track, and you come in, and I'm holding you accountable each week because you got to come in and tell me whether you did it or not, and why on the days you didn't, what happened those days, and what made it easier, you successful on the days you did it. And then we start to just take that and make that a bit longer. And now it's, 15 minutes. And yeah, standing beside your bed for 15 minutes is a long time. That's kind of the point, because then you're going to go, well, I might as well make a coffee. Like, I'm going to be here for a quarter of an hour. So let's just put a pot of coffee. And now you're starting to do tasks and you're getting out of bed slowly. But the point is that whatever that safety behavior is for you, that going back to bed, canceling plans, whatever it is, video game playing, whatever is your avoidance strategy, we would say, that needs to be left on the table.
You still need something to kind of draw back to as a safety net, and let you know it's still there. I can go back if I need to.
Yeah, and I encourage you to use it, right? Like, so use it, but accomplish the goal first, is if you can. But we build it into the treatment plan. It's like, you're gonna fucking fail, and that's okay. We want you to fail, because when you fail, we can see what skills or tools were we, do we know that work and that we weren't using, that we didn't know that didn't work and you were using, or other skills that we need to start to bring in to help you next time, right?
Yeah. See, and I've heard that in the entrepreneur world, is either I win or I learn. Right? There's no losing. There's a win or I learn. So now with that, you may not have won that day, but you learned how far you made it and what you need to do to make it farther. And the way that you're talking about it, for me, again, I'm going to relate it to the entrepreneur side of things, is what you're doing is you're creating habits with small goals. And that's, in the mindset channel, I'm going to talk about that exact thing, is you breaking down. Yeah, you have your yearly goals, which are your massive goals, which you want to accomplish in life. Then you have your monthly goals, then you have your daily goals, and it gets smaller than that. And accomplishing this much over time causes you to have the compound effect and accomplish the big picture. As long as that movement is properly directed, and you're not confusing movement with progress, then everything should be good. And essentially, that's what you're doing. You're trying to make it so that way they're not just moving; they're progressing, right? So you're in a way, you're kind of being scientific about it and saying, okay, this is what we need to change. This is what we can hang on to. Here's your safety net. To tomorrow, we're going to try and add another minute to that. And it's kind of cool how you broke that down, actually. That's a neat way to think about it.
And I think, too, it's really important for people that are listening and struggling, right? Because where things shift between what you're talking about, what I'm talking about, is my ability to see clearly and believe, not just know rationally, but believe that me failing isn't failing. But if I'm severely depressed, me not accomplishing another goal could be just another kind of nail in the coffin for me that week, right? Yeah. And so it's that shift. There's a bit of a leap of faith that needs to happen between when I can conceivably believe that if I fail, right? And this is why I emphasize it to like ad nauseum in session, is that I expect you to fail this week. I don't know when it will be, right? I don't know when, but in the next 7 days, you're not going to be successful, and I want you to track that and tell me when it happened and why.
See, and right there, I like that, because you're actually getting them comfortable with that situation. Yeah, letting them know it's going to fucking happen. Yeah. It happens to all of us. It does. And you need to get used to that. And you need to get comfortable with it, but not in that negative sense. You need to have that shift.
Yeah. And if I can build it into the treatment plan, then they can put the onus on me.
That's right.
Right. And that's what I call, I joke with them. I said, we just call this the pull cord, right? Whatever gets the engine going, let's do it. But the engine needs to run afterwards on its own. And that's their work, right? So you can blame me, but I'm telling you right now, we're building it into the treatment plan, and I expect you to fail. Right. And so I want to know when it was and what happened, because then we know what the new threshold is. Because if you're able to get out of bed 6 times and that 7th time you're not, something happened on that 7th time, or on that 6th day, right? That night before, something happened there. And so how do we shift and morph what we know to be working, that other 6, to help you accomplish 7 out of 7?
Right. I see. Trial and error basis, really.
A lot of the ways, but we also, before we go leaping into it, it's really important to build these skills. It's really important for me to help you see that the way you're thinking about things might actually be multiple thinking traps used all at once, and you're trying to rationalize yourself out of a trap that you can't get out of because you're in the trap, right? Yeah. Right? So we got to be able to break those. You got to be able to identify what you're feeling and why, and how is that different than a thought, right? We say I feel statements, but the majority of the time I feel statements is followed by a thought statement. And I can't change a thought statement the same way, because a thought statement I can't control, but an emotion statement I can, right? So a thought is just going to come to you. Like right now, you probably weren't thinking about Paris, but now that I said it, you probably are. And so, I'm more control of your thoughts than you are. But if I'm starting to use, I'm trying to make this so it doesn't sound complicated. If I'm trying to use I feel statements, but I say I feel stupid, right? There's something just language wise that makes that a hard thing to navigate. And I think you and I have talked about this before, about what would you say to somebody who says, I feel stupid? You'd be like, oh, you're not stupid. Like, here's all the reasons why, right? Yeah. But if I say, I think I'm stupid, somebody goes, well, that's just a thought, right? That's almost like an automatic response. It's almost, it's like,
quickly wipe that away.
Yeah, you're just, so it's just a thought. And thoughts aren't real.
Yeah, I guess, and I could, just hearing you say, I think and I feel, you can feel the emotion in I feel. Yeah. You can feel, I can feel you saying that. And then when you said I think, that was my first initial thought was wipe it away.
Yeah.
Not a big deal.
Yeah. And so, we call that monkey mind, this idea that we're not actually in control of our thoughts, and we're not. But the idea is that we can control what we do with them. And so we can allow those thoughts to manufacture emotion, which, so this could be that mindset piece where I can manufacture anxiety by worrying excessively over and above what I need to worry about for this thing. Or I can recognize that I'm having a thought. I didn't choose to have that thought, and I don't need to attach my energies to that thought.
See, and I originally I'd never heard of that. That's kind of it's again. That's a different way of thinking about it. That's it's. I've learned a lot sitting and talking with you, Sensei. It's cool to talk to you because you do have that education. You've been taught to look at those things and see those things and catch those things. And I actually remember talking about a similar thing like that in a couple episodes ago. It was probably like our first or second one, but after that I started to pick up on those things and like you just said with the whole feel and think right away, I felt that, and then after you explained it to me, I was like, oh shit, like that just happened. And we constantly do that to ourselves, right? If you're constantly being negative to yourself and you're saying I feel stupid and I feel ugly, that you're physically giving yourself a feeling. That's weird. That's crazy to think about.
Well, and because there is a real emotion, and emotions are hard because they're often cut off to us. So we fill that space with a thought statement. This is the reason why, right? And this is the reason why you'll say I feel overwhelmed. Isn't because you know what you're feeling and therefore you're just choosing overwhelmed because that's the emotion. You're saying that because you don't know what you're feeling, but you know that it's a lot of something.
That's right. And you're trying to explain that.
That's right. And so we use I feel statements because I feel stupid is a thought, but what's associated with that thought? Usually embarrassment, maybe shame, maybe whatever, right? But we're not trained or taught how to tap into that and talk about those things.
Yeah, I guess because I still do that. I definitely tell people, like I'm just overwhelmed, and that's I definitely need to try and learn how to narrow in on what it is that's going on so I can combat that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I often joke with clients, they bring it up, right? But like you're walking down the street, someone says, hey, how are you? You're not going to say, well, I'm actually feeling really shameful right now, right? You're still going to say, I'm fine.
I'm fine.
And when people talk to you, you'll still default to saying I'm overwhelmed. But when you're, maybe with your partner or when you're on your own, just doing reflection, to be able to tap into it and actually clearly and specifically let that laser focus be able to identify what you're feeling, you're going to find that you're way more, you're way more effective at navigating and trying to deal with that emotion because you know exactly what you're dealing with. My joke to people who come in and say they're overwhelmed is I have zero skills to help you feel underwhelmed. I just don't have any, right? And so what we need to do is identify what you're feeling, and that we have skills for.
That's right. It's a good way to think about it, actually. Definitely chatting with my wife. That's exactly how it is. It's eventually you realize, oh, that's why I was feeling that way. And this is what I was feeling during that whole argument,
Yeah.
And it is kind of neat how you can break it down, especially if you have time to sit and think about it.
Yeah, and you have somebody who's on the same wavelength that'll sit down and reflect with you, and you're able to both hear the things that the other person needs to say, right? That can be a really difficult thing, but holy shit, can you learn a lot?
Oh, we don't fight anymore. We talk.
Yeah, that can be harder.
Yeah, well, and sometimes it is because it gets pretty emotional, but it's kind of funny. Like you get that 1 yearly now is what it's come down to, and we haven't been together that long. Like I think we're coming up on 5 years now, maybe 6, and we figured it out right away. The first year, she used to scream in my face, and this is how I talk to her. I'm not much of a screamer. I won't argue with her. I won't yell at her. I literally hug her and say, "We need to talk." And when you're done yelling at me, we can talk. Because I don't like being yelled at. And eventually it got to the point it was like, okay, the first thing we would do is identify why we were feeling that way and what it is we were actually feeling.
Yeah.
And it was kind of neat how all of a sudden just we put 2 and 2 together and it was like, okay, let's have the chat now.
But think about how powerful that is, right? And you're effectively using the skills and tools that we've just been chatting about in order to navigate, interpersonal conflict. Right? You're talking about identifying what we're feeling. You're talking about acting from a place of kind of that, mixture between emotionality and rationality, where I'm not so emotional, I'm coming unhinged, as it were, right? We call that, acting clearly an emotion mind versus that kind of cold, collected and disconnected, just
fact-based kind of rational mind, but you're working in the middle, which is this wise mind of saying, you know, I see what you're feeling, and you seem to be feeling X, and I'm feeling Y, and we can sit down and talk about it. And now that you're both on that wavelength, it becomes a really difficult and hard thing, but it becomes one that you both can manage because, you know, A, you trust each other, obviously, and B, you've learned that that vulnerability comes with actual new and regained strength, which is one of the hardest things for folks to learn.
Yeah, I think I picked it up from my dad, because that's listening to him and my mom argue. That's exactly how it is. Like, I always tell my wife, I don't want to be too much like my dad, and then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, that was just like my father. You know, like,
Yeah.
what is the world coming to?
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're 50% him, so that's going to come out here and there.
So, but she's like, thank God, because it's like when we have an argument, it feels like you get me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's good.
Yeah, that's exactly what you want.
Yeah.
I'm just eyeing the time, and I need my beauty sleep, bud.
Yeah, I get it. I was looking at it too. I was going to cut it short 20 minutes ago, but we started getting on a rant. All of a sudden, we found our groove.
We did find it. It was good.